good afternoon, and good evening to everyone from all over the world who's joined this session. I'll be your host and moderator for today. I'm Christina Angelova. I'm part of WWF Singapore Sustainable Finance team, where I lead our Asia Sustainable Finance Initiative, or ASFI. And a bit about what ASFI is. It's a collaborative multi-stakeholder platform that engages with the finance sector, making sure it delivers on the Sustainable Development Goals, as well as the Paris Agreement and net zero targets. Of course, sessions like these are one way in which we do engage with financial institutions, but another way, and something exciting that we've recently launched, is our ASFI Academy, which is a suite of online learning courses. And we do have one specifically on agriculture, forestry, and fisheries for asset managers, which today's topic does touch upon. So perhaps before introducing the participants, I'll just run through the program for today with you. So of course, we'll start with the welcome and the introductions, and then we have two presentations, one from FAIR Initiative on their protein index with a specific focus on Asia. And then we have a presentation from the Value Reporting Foundation, Devon, on this latest updates on SASB standards in regard to alternative products. Then, of course, we'll break into the panel discussion, where I'm hoping we'll have a deep dive into the topic. And then we have the audience Q&A session just before the closing. On the Q&A session, please feel free to drop your questions throughout the discussion and the presentations today. And during the Q&A, also feel free to unmute yourself and ask your question directly to the panelists. We want to make this session as interactive as possible. So I'll head over to Eileen, but I guess today we'll be tackling quite an interesting topic, the one about sustainable food systems and where alternative proteins fits under that, what we mean by alternative protein, and the various ways in which financing can help to build sustainable diets and a sustainable planet through mechanisms. So I will now stop here because we have a lot of interesting information to cover with our speakers and panelists. So first, I'll introduce Eileen Reinches from FAIR Initiative. So Eileen, over to you. Please do introduce yourself and a little more information about FAIR.
Hi, I'm Eileen. I'm part of the policy team at FAIR. Thank you for inviting FAIR to the panel. I'll just quickly introduce FAIR first, and then I'll present some of our protein producer index findings specifically on Asia. Next slide, please. So FAIR is an investor network, and its members represent $47 trillion of assets under management. And our members are interested in addressing the risk in the animal protein sector and food systems in general. So FAIR produces research and tools for investors and for companies, informing companies of practical opportunities to improve their operations, and also sharing industry best practice. And for investors, we create tools to inform analysis and also informing how to direct flows of finance into the industry. We also run collaborative engagements, including one on sustainable proteins and also a meat sourcing engagement, which focus on climate risk mitigation. And FAIR has also recently launched a new policy workstream, which kind of engages investor members on policy that's relevant to food systems and sustainable finance as well. Next slide, please. So consumption of animal-based foods is expected to increase 79% between 2006 and 2050. And the biggest increase shown in this graph on the right is in Asia, where meat production has increased around 15 times since the 60s, according to some research. And the fast growth of the sector has improved the availability of and accessibility of protein sources, and also brought economic and social benefits, but it's also come at a cost, and the sector is actually one of the main drivers of the most harmful environmental and social risks that we face today. Next slide, please. So FAIR's work aims to highlight and kind of address these risks. There's this sort of famous quotes or piece of research saying that even if fossil fuel emissions were eliminated immediately now, emissions from the global food system would actually still make it impossible to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees. And in the bar, the black bar in the graph on the right shows how business as usual would take up almost the entire global carbon budget. And then there's some more sustainable and ambitious scenarios shown by the other colors there. Next slide. Oh yeah. So one of the tools that FAIR produces, like Christina mentioned, is the Protein Producer Index, which assesses the 60 largest publicly listed protein producing companies in the world, and it assesses them on 9 risk categories, which are listed on the right here, and then one sort of opportunity factor, which is exposure to sustainable protein. And it ranks companies according to their performance and their reporting on these different risks. And the latest version of the index with new data was launched in December, so just over a month ago. Next slide, please. So almost half of the 60 largest protein producing companies which are assessed in our Protein Producer Index are located in the Asia region, 27 of them, and the colors on the map here show kind of their average ranking. A large share of these 27 companies are headquartered in China, and 12 of them, and either listed in mainland China or on the Hong Kong exchange. And the second largest number of companies are in Thailand and in Japan, with 4 companies each. Next slide, please. So in the index, 77% of the Asian companies rank as high risk overall, which is a slight improvement from last year when it was 82%. But only 1 currently ranks as low risk. And the companies in the index collectively produce all 5 protein types which the index covers. But the most common in Asia are pork, dairy, and poultry and eggs. But a lot of the companies covered in the index also produce a combination of 2 or more of these protein types. Next slide, please. So of the 27 index companies that we cover that are based in Asia, only 4 of them have set or are committed to setting science-based targets for emission reductions. And currently no company has a scope 3 target that includes agricultural emissions, but there is one company, Thai Union, which is in the process of developing a scope 3 target as part of their science-based target setting. So overall, there's still quite a large share that ranks high risk on greenhouse gas emissions and scope 1, 2, and 3 targets in the index in Asia. Next slide, please. So the majority of Asian companies rank as high risk on antibiotics use. And when animals are regularly administered antibiotics that are closely related to those in human medicine, then bacteria that cause disease can become resistant to the drugs, which causes antimicrobial resistance. So antibiotic use and monitoring this is really important in sort of managing risks in the sector. And disclosure of data on antibiotics used by animal protein producers would also help governments track and monitor antimicrobial resistance and disease potential, and in turn kind of help investors manage the resulting risks. And similarly, all 27 of the Asia-based companies in the index currently score high risk on biodiversity, water use, and pollution and waste. Whereas working conditions, governance, and food safety are sort of the best performing categories on average. in the region. Next slide, please. So of course, aquaculture is an important industry for the Asia region. The Asia Pacific aquaculture market is, according to research, expected to grow at a compound annual growth rate of 7.9% during a forecast period between 2019 and 2027. And the aquaculture focus of the Protein Producer Index focuses on two species which are extensively farmed, which is salmon and shrimp. And because they're carnivorous fish, which are farmed in often ecologically sensitive habitats, their production is kind of linked to multiple risks. So there's a few risk indicators that are specifically, that aquaculture companies in the index are specifically assessed on, which other companies are not, which are listed on the right. So ecosystem impacts, certification, disease management, feed ingredients, and conversion ratios, and also animal welfare specifically for aquatic companies. And Asian companies perform slightly lower than their peers in other regions on antibiotic use risk, but there is some, or quite a bit lower, but there is some improvement year on year, which is shown by the green parts of the bars in the graph on the right. Next slide, please. So our sustainable protein sort of opportunity factor score assesses companies' exposure to and sort of diversification into alternative protein, and also tells us something about the future trends of alternative protein in the region. So now in the last version of the data, it shows that 44% or 12 out of 27 companies in Asia are now reporting having some exposure to alternative proteins, meaning they've either reported having their own alternative protein brand, or they're conducting research and development into alternative protein, or have some sort of target to diversify their production. And that's compared to just 18% in 2019, so that's quite a big growth. And globally, nearly half of companies in the index now also have alternative protein exposure. Next slide, please. So Asia, China have recently been kind of at the forefront of plant-based expansion, and demand for pork meat has fallen, especially in China, following African swine fever and also COVID-19. Demand for protein is growing, and demand for plant-based protein is kind of, the growth in that is reflected by some growth in sales for brands like Omnipork. And this shift in demand has also been noticed by international brands that are coming in and have entered the Chinese plant-based market, like Starbucks, KFC, Nestle, and Oatly, among others. And our index data shows that domestic producers are also diversifying and launching plant-based dairy brands or soy-based meat and seafood alternatives, and also investing in alternative protein research and development. There's also been a number of cultured meat startups that have kind of sprung up over the past few years in China and Singapore, as well as Japan and Hong Kong. So data from FAIR and the Good Food Institute shows that global VC investment in alternative protein is rising quite rapidly, and it is kind of projected to rise further, especially from 2019 onwards in this, in the graph on this slide. Next slide, please. So Singapore has positioned itself as a sort of first mover in the alternative protein development and investment space. And in 2021, it became the first country to approve cultured meat for sale in the world. And FAIR's report on alternative proteins shows that the Singapore government has invested $144 million, and the Japanese government has invested 2.7, and India 0.6 million in alternative protein R&D and production. And on the sort of regulation and green finance side, South Korea, China, and the ASEAN countries have recently all introduced sustainable finance taxonomies. And at the beginning of this month, actually, the Chinese Ministry of Ecology and Environment announced new mandatory disclosure rules for environmental information from domestic companies in China. So these kind of regulatory changes on reporting and investment in alt protein could start taking effect in FAIR's index data over the next few years. Next slide. Oh yeah, thank you. I'll hand it back to Christina, and if you have any questions, feel free to just put them in the Q&A.
Thank you very much, Aline. I think we do have one question that's come in, which we will address a little later. I'm sure I have a list already for the panel discussion, but before that, let's jump to Devin and the SASB standards update.
Great, thank you, Christina. Hi, everyone. It's great to be here tonight. Tonight for me, today for most of you. My name is Devin Bonney, and I'm an analyst and the food and beverage sector lead at the Value Reporting Foundation. And next slide. Before we dive into the project that we're working on related to alternative protein, just want to give a brief update on the Value Reporting Foundation and the IFRS to set up our conversation. So next slide. At COP26, the IFRS Foundation announced 3 different things, which are all very exciting for the ESG disclosure space. The first is that they are creating the International Sustainability Standards Board. And with that comes a consolidation with CDSB and our organization, the Value Reporting Foundation. And they also published, a climate and general disclosure prototype requirements. And the goal of the ISSB, if we want to go to the next slide, is really to develop a global baseline for sustainability disclosure standards, focusing on meeting the needs of investors and companies so that they can provide a comprehensive sustainability information to global capital markets, and also facilitate the addition of requirements that are jurisdiction specific. And so really the IFRS Foundation and ISSB don't want to start from scratch, and they want to leverage current sustainability standards, which includes the SASB standards. So everything I'll talk about today is still very relevant to ISSB and the future consolidation, but do just want to disclose this up front. So if we want to go to the next slide. So just to give a brief overview on how the standards were developed originally, and then I'll go into the alternative products project specifically that we're working on. So if we go to the next slide, the SASB standards are a global standard. They are used by companies and investors globally, and we have 77 industry-specific disclosure standards. If we want to go to the next slide. And really, the SASB standards were developed to really highlight those sustainability or ESG topics that are likely to be financially material or affect the value creation of a company, decision useful for the capital markets, specifically investors, cost effective for companies to report to. So really focusing on what's financially material and not a really long list. Industry specific, because each industry faces different risks and opportunities as it comes to ESG. Evidence-based, so we have a very rigorous process, and then market informed, meaning we seek out stakeholder input on all of the standards that we create and all the projects that we work on. So we're going to go to the next slide. This is the robust process I was talking about. So we start with a very broad list of sustainability issues that sort of fall under different dimensions, which includes environment, social capital, human capital, business model and innovation, and leadership and governance. And we apply industry research to that, really look for evidence of financial impact, again, get market input from different advisory groups, investor consultations, and other stakeholders in the market. We vet that evidence with our standards board. We released exposure drafts for public comment. And then finally, there was the revision and approval of the standards back in 2018. And now we're undergoing an ongoing standards maintenance process, which is where the research I am doing currently on alternative products falls. But we're still following the same rigorous process to understand if and how we should update our standards. So just want to go to the next slide. And when we go to our standards board and they decide what goes into our standards, we always fall back on our conceptual framework, which just lays out sort of the criteria of what we need to see evidence for to include a new topic or to add a metric into the standards. So the topics need to highlight those issues that are likely to affect value creation, of interest to investors, like we talked about, just as an example. And then the metrics need to be applicable and comparable and complete to measure performance on those financially material ESG topics. So that's just to give a broad sense of what the standards are for those who may not be as familiar. And if we dive into our research on the next 2 slides ahead. Oh, can you click through so this goes all? Yeah, thanks. One more. So this research started back in February of 2020, so it's been 2 years, and we wanted to communicate to the market that we were understanding that the landscape was changing and that there could be associated ESG impacts with alternative products. And really what started that was evidence that 65% of global consumers were eating more plant-based food and beverages back then, in part for health and animal welfare reasons, but also for environmental reasons. And then when we looked at life cycle analysis of these different types of alternative products, we found that there could be significant land use reduction impacts and GHG emission reduction and water use. And so this is something we've been actively monitoring over the past 2 years. If we want to go to the next slide. And we have also seen that there's been financial impact, and the market thinks that, or analysts think that this is really going to become the norm by 2040. So on the left, you're looking at a graph of what the meat market could look like by 2040, or the protein market. And this is an analysis done where they think that traditional meat will only be 40% of the meat market, whereas plant-based or cultured is going to take up the majority. We've seen dairy sales decrease, where alternative dairy sales have increased. And so the last slide in this just really highlight, okay, we have evidence of environmental impact. Now we have evidence of financial impact. And so we went out to the market and got some input. And there's been strong level of investor interest on better understanding the ESG impacts and protein diversification for the meat, poultry, dairy industry, food retailers and distributors, and processed food companies. We've seen corporate feedback saying that they're using alternative products to help manage some of these ESG issues and meet consumer demand. And so all of this combined led us to start a standard setting project to really understand how we want to update our standards. So if we want to go 2 slides ahead. We are currently in a draft metric phase of this project. So this project, the standard setting work on how we're actually going to update the standards, really started back in September at our standards board meeting, where they voted to really launch the project. And so the bolded metrics are the ones that we've gotten sort of the most traction in terms of stakeholder feedback on. So a quantitative metric, for example, in the meat, poultry, dairy industry might be percentage of products produced by protein type, and then we list out the different types of proteins. Similar for processed food, and then food retailers and distributors, there could be a focus on private label versus non-private label. And then all of them have the same draft qualitative metric, which is really the discussion of the process to incorporate ESG factors in product development. So are companies thinking about scenario analysis planning, or doing an ingredient trade-off analysis, or are they implementing regenerative agriculture practices? Really, what are the considerations that companies are making to determine what ingredients are going into products that they produce? And I will say these are very, very draft metrics, so these are not out for public comment or exposure draft. But with that said, if we go to the next slide, we are aiming to get an exposure draft of what the changes to the industry standards might look like in the first half of this year. And so we're actively in a consultation period with the goal of developing or modifying disclosure topics and metrics as it relates to alternative products. So you can subscribe to project updates on our project page, and then you can certainly email me directly if you want to be a part of the consultation to provide input on what metrics we should be using to measure performance on alternative products. And with that, I'll pass it back off to Christina.
Thank you very much, Devin. And I encourage all of you to perhaps, if you do have any input, get involved in the consultation. It's very valuable, of course, not only to the Value Reporting Foundation, but in general to industry and to the environment. So with that, I'd like to bring the rest of the panelists and to invite them to the conversation. So today we'll be speaking to Elaine Rainchef from FAIR Initiative, as well as Dr. Helena Wright. They're both the program officer and policy director, respectively. We also have Devin Bonney, who you've already met from Value Reporting Foundation. She's the food and beverage sector lead, and Christian Cadeo, who's managing partner Asia for Big Idea Ventures. I will perhaps invite all of you, all of the panelists, to introduce yourselves a little more about your organizations for those newcomers from the audience. And perhaps I'll kickstart the questions with a baseline question, perhaps for all, to set the bar. What for you is a sustainable food system or a sustainable protein? Perhaps shall we start with Christian and Helena and then go to Devin and Elaine?
Sorry, Christian.
Oh, Helena, go ahead first. Having some
Okay, no problem. So hi, I'm Helena Wright. I'm the policy director here at the FAIR Initiative. And actually, that's quite an interesting question in terms of what we mean by sustainable food system. And I think that some of the research out there probably plays into this kind of debate. I mean, we know that the kind of rising consumption of the animal protein products is a major driver of climate risk, and as it does make it impossible to meet the 1.5 climate goals. One of the useful reports in this regard was the Eat Lancet guidelines, Eat Lancet report out a number of years ago, as well as the IPCC report, and that looked at kind of a science-based guide for the planetary health as well. And we have seen a number of governments kind of integrating those guidelines as well, so based on the science of what's needed in terms of consumption in the and production sort of in the animal protein sector to make the sector more sustainable. So we are seeing a number of different companies, as Aline's mentioned in the presentation, sort of diversify into sustainable protein now as a way to meet sort of their climate goals, nature goals as well. But I would say the growth rates probably now, it's not clear whether that's really in line with, say, the climate goals. And one thing that we're actually calling for at the moment, and a lot of investors has mentioned, is we do need a clearer sort of roadmap towards a more sustainable food and agricultural system, because there isn't at the moment any equivalent to the IEA's net zero roadmap for the sector. So that's something that a number of different investors have mentioned recently. We do need a bit of a clearer trajectory, and roadmap would be very useful actually. And that would be useful both to, not only to align obviously with climate change goals, which is obviously very important, and climate risk, but also with ecosystems and protecting nature as well, because we know that, you know, a number of companies are now making pledges essentially to meet the global nature goals. We know many countries have made pledges now to prevent deforestation, and many financial institutions as well. So I think it's important for us to, in the future, have a bit of a clearer roadmap. So that's something we're going to be calling for this year, actually, and supporting our investors to call for essentially a better guideline and metrics.
I can't speak any more articulate and more clear than what Helen mentioned, right? So I won't try to add anything for the sake of adding anything, but I think where we play as a venture capital fund is making sure, as part of a sustainable food system, it clearly has to be collaborative, right? And there's many stakeholders in there that are focused, whether it's on environmental, social, well-being, et cetera. What we come in is on the economic perspective, right? So there has to be return for investors that will fit within this framework of other stakeholders. So I think that's, so again, I can't add much more than Helen. She's done spot on in that, and I agree wholeheartedly, right? So where we play is on the economic aspect of it, and how can we help it within this ecosystem, and making sure that it's a balanced and a fair and, again, sustainable system for all parties involved.
And I'll take a little bit of a different approach. So at the Value Reporting Foundation, we don't really define what a sustainable food system is or what is a sustainable protein. As a standard setter, we have to remain very neutral. And so our approach is that if the standards can help companies communicate information on sustainability issues that are likely to affect value creation, whether on the risk side or on the opportunity side, then investors can start comparing how companies are performing on those issues they really care about. And then you raise the bar in terms of what's acceptable, what that baseline is for a company's impact. And investors can start to better understand what those trade-offs might be. And so that's sort of how we think about sustainability holistically, and it's not any different when we think about the food and beverage space.
Eileen, do you want to perhaps add anything to what Helena said, or I guess you have a similar perspective?
Yeah, I think I don't have that much more to add, just that I think, like Helena said, it's very important to sort of have this sustainable shift and roadmap to 1.5 and nature goals, but we're also taking into account in that in the call for that sort of the other planetary boundaries, and also making sure that it does not sort of exacerbate inequality or affect livelihoods, especially in certain regions where that might be more relevant. But I think, yeah, other than that, not much to add.
No, thank you for that. And it was interesting to hear, each of your perspectives, one from a standard setting organization, another one that's, an investor membership organization, and of course from an investor as well. But, and I mean, I think that sustainable transition is the big question. How do we do that? And what is that? So I think, coming from Singapore, those of you who are based in Singapore as well, I think we're quite biased here just in a personal day-to-day experience in terms of alternatives to animal products. I mean, anywhere you go, you can find an alternative to your, milk and cappuccino, or, within the supermarket, there's a broad range of products that can substitute your, beef patties. So despite this recent, rise in consumer demand for plant-based and other alternative proteins, right? Looking into the numbers, still a very high chunk of the market is animal dominated. So I think it's estimated that around 97% of the meat and around 85% of the dairy market is still dominated by protein from animal sources. So I mean, having those numbers in mind, and I remember Devin's presentation as well in the different scenarios. How do we, first of all, what is that sustainable mix between plant-based versus animal protein or diets? And then how do we channel capital towards this transition? I think, yeah, this question, feel free, anyone who has an answer to tackle it, perhaps one or all of you.
Yeah, I can jump in on this. I think obviously, as shown in Lee's presentation, we are seeing a big growth in the alternatives sector and the food sector. So we're seeing a lot of companies obviously diversify now towards sustainable protein, and they're committing to science-based targets as well to meet their climate goals. But as you mentioned, the sort of the baseline, the growth of the traditional animal protein products is still increasing as well. So it is kind of a alternative sector that in its nascent stage, it's not yet sort of meeting the increased demand for animal protein that we're seeing. So I think that's where essentially, we're definitely going to see more growth in the sector as well, but hasn't yet sort of reached the full potential in terms of environmental benefits, because as you know, there's a sort of increased demand for the animal protein baseline of those products as well. So, I mean, there's slightly differences, say, in the dairy sector, which I think you mentioned. So in the US now, like 15% of the dairy market is now made up by plant-based alternatives. So that's really quite a significant sort of portion of the sector. So it's breaking through a lot more into market demand, and there's a lot more consumer demand than in other areas. So that's an interesting sort of example what we could see in terms of growth in other areas as well. But I do think that potentially, and I'm not sure whether others would agree, the COVID sort of situation might have had some impact on these areas, because I feel like it has been probably quite a stressful time for people. And I mean, just anecdotally, I think people aren't really focused on health as much potentially as, if it's a very stressful time. I'm not sure. That's more anecdotal than anything else, but I don't think that people or consumers potentially have been focused as much on their health as before the pandemic, because they're just focused on their livelihoods essentially.
I could probably add a little bit from an investment perspective. And I think, look, when we look at a portfolio, interesting enough, I think outside of sourcing of raw ingredients, depending on the region you are, most of their business, and we mostly invest in very early stage startups, most of them, frankly, haven't actually been impacted. In fact, the business has actually accelerated within COVID. I do agree with Helena in the sense that I think people in terms of eating healthy has been kind of gone to the wayside. So I don't really know what we'd attribute to. I think it's more of the fact maybe people are, I could be saying anecdotally, people are staying home more, so they want to be more, they want to try a little bit more and experiment a little bit more, or maybe have more disposable income because people aren't traveling. Whatever the case is, interesting enough, just like everything else is kind of been topsy crazy in this whole COVID period, at least for startups within this alternative protein, the last 2 years, business has accelerated. Granted, it's from very small base, but the numbers have actually gone faster than what we think. So we actually think it's been almost a kickstart, almost a spark that really has shortened the time frame of where these businesses could scale even faster if there was no, unfortunately COVID, but if there was no COVID. So I think what we're seeing there, again, it's from a small base. So let's see what happens in the upcoming years as, COVID hopefully resides and so forth, economic turbulence and so forth as well.
I would also say, in addition to the fact that alternative proteins have been growing and COVID has accelerated that, I think that it's important to look at this holistically. And I don't think that, it's really hard to say what that right mix it will be, but I think it is truly a mix. And, you have to make trade-offs. Is it better to source locally a beef patty, or is it better to get raw materials from across the world? And these are sort of trade-offs that every company has to look at, investors have to look at as they determine what is a sustainable protein, or what are the risks and opportunities each company faces. And I will also say that yes, we've seen a huge environmental reduction in terms of what alternative proteins can do, but there's also a social aspect. As you transition an industry away, what are the social implications of that as well, right? So you really have to, I would say, look at this holistically, and it's not just one aspect, but really how are we collectively changing the entire food system. And I will say farmers are experimenting with switching out feed for beef, adding seaweed in instead of soy, and that helps reduce methane emissions. So really, what are companies doing to diversify, but also to still help reduce the environmental impacts of traditional meat products?
Eileen, perhaps do you want to add anything?
Yeah, I think in terms of sort of channeling capital towards the transition and bringing more investment towards alternatives, I think highlighting the risks associated with the traditional production, especially in the companies that we've covered in our index, which are the 60 largest listed ones. That might kind of help allocate some of the finance to more sustainable practices, and also make companies and investors aware of what the risks are. But obviously that's focused on the sort of largest companies and not on the smallholder production. So there's definitely a sort of a difference there.
Yeah, no, thank you. And I think, speaking of risks and climate risks in particular, I mean, we've seen all of these growing numbers of financial institutions strengthening their climate disclosures and climate action plans, as well as we've seen a number of net zero commitments now, of course, after COP in relation to the GFANs. So in line with all of these commitments, what does that mean for F&A, for food and agri portfolios?
Yeah, we're happy to jump in here as well. So, I mean, we have a lot of sort of investor members that are now kind of adopting sort of net zero goals, etc. So that's quite interesting to see for the sector. Many of those will be sort of calling on portfolio companies to adopt science-based targets, etc. in the food sector. But also, you know, there's a lot of interest in new areas for food and agriculture. I mean, some of the ones that Devon already mentioned. Sort of regenerative agriculture, as well as sustainable protein, lots of investments going into sort of new production methods that would reduce climate risks as well. And actually FAIR has a climate risk tool that's supposed to kind of help with assessing portfolio risks. So it's one of the first kind of TCFD tools for the sector. We'll be adapting that tool again this year and releasing a new iteration with sort of new modeling to pilot that tool as well. So I think the use of the TCFD framework is another one which will help investors to basically understand what the risks are, not only actually on the emissions and the transition risk, but also the physical risk of climate change, which we haven't mentioned yet, but the fact that the sector is very vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. So we may see sort of price rises or crop losses, etc., in certain areas, and that will have knock-on material impacts with the increasing droughts and floods, etc. So that's another very important risk which investors have to consider.
Thank you, Helena. Does anyone else perhaps have any other thoughts to add to this question?
I would just add that it's great that companies are making these commitments, but really what's going to matter is how are they achieving those commitments and what is the progress towards them. And I think that a lot of that comes with setting goals and targets, but then also communicating your performance and being transparent about it. So just to plug that, companies, I think there'll be a higher demand for disclosures, whether through TCFD or the SASB standards or GRI, whatever companies decide is most relevant for them to report to. But if you want to get the attention of investors, companies will need to start being more transparent about how they're reaching those goals, or there could be an increased demand for that.
No, thank you very much, Devon. And I agree with that. And I will have a follow-up question later. But before that, I actually wanted to go to Christian and dig a little deeper into Big Idea Ventures. And just kind of get to understand, like, why alternative protein specifically? What was that one reason that kind of, why are you specializing specifically in this area? And also, can you also share with us a little more about the landscape in Asia, what it looks like at the moment? As well as, I guess, how alternative proteins, whether they have or how they have the potential to positively impact people and planet, especially now in this pandemic when, obviously global supply chains are quite disrupted.
Yeah, so I think we could say we started, our founders, Andrew, based in New York, him and I, was very from the start, we started the fund, he's obviously founder and GP, we started about 3 years ago, right? So we've been on this journey for about quite long years. And before that, I was actually one of the first employed at a company called Eat Just, which had some good times, had some bad times, so mostly tumultuous time, but that's a whole nother story. So I was there back in 2014. So I've always been in this sector, at least the second iteration, right? Because the reality is plant-based foods, vegetarian food has been in existence for thousands of years, right? So it's not novel. I mean, the technology has improved, but I guess the second coming that really started during that cohort in 2014, 2012, 2013 with Beyond Impossible and Eat Just, right? So I could say that I've been in this industry for quite a long time, almost 10 years now, right? So why we started Big Idea Ventures was really simple. I think we basically felt like, hey, in terms of, well, obviously as investors from an economic perspective, that made a lot of sense in that, right? But I think that's kind of a ancillary benefit. What we really felt was like, look, logically, this industry makes a lot of sense, not only from consumers, from manufacturers, from investors, and collectively everyone, is because the simple fact was, and taking my experience at Just, was in the next 5 or 10 years, hopefully shorter time frame, when you have the option between a plant-based or cell-based or maybe a microalgae or fermentation product versus a typical animal protein, our bet, and this may be wildly bullish, but we bet our thesis on this is, the alternative protein product will be, if not on par from a price perspective, definitely cheaper than animal protein. Number two, from a taste perspective, probably close to it, maybe exceeds it, maybe not, but relatively close to the animal protein. And then in terms of price, tasting, and in terms of texture and so forth, it's going to be the same. And then you get all the ancillary benefits, potential health benefits, et cetera, as well as, more importantly, environmental benefit. And what consumer would say no to that? Because I don't think there's any consumer who are actually buying products because they want to eat a dead animal, right? They want to buy because it tastes good, it's cheaper, has great texture, et cetera, and if it's more healthy for them to do it. So it was just logical that this sector was going to grow by leaps and bounds. And if you append that with also the economic returns in it, which there are, it just made logic sense for us to kind of aggregate a bunch of capital and then invest in the sector really early on. So, one of the things that we invest on, and we are the first check in terms of making investments in terms of global companies. So we don't only invest in Asia. So, Christina, to answer your question, we saw that there was a confluence of multiple factors that made this super attractive. Obviously, one is environmental concerns. Number two is consumer preferences who are moving towards this. And then third, of course, we're investors, is economically. It was attractive. So basically all those conflicts came together and said, okay, well, based on that, why don't we start Big Idea Ventures? And we're quite proud to say, after 3 years, we've made, I think at this point, 67 investments, probably about 67 investments globally. I think all across plant-based, cell-based, et cetera, geographically, most of it, 40% in US, 30% in Asia. 63% of them are actually investments in companies that are either 100% led by women, amazing women founders, or are co-founders. And then in terms of 57% of them, obviously I'm reading off a deck to do this, so this is a little bit rehearsed, but 50% of our founders are actually non-Caucasian as well. So we're seeing this really nice kind of diversity, inclusion that are happening with economic return. So that's kind of why we started it. To answer your second question, I think it was pertaining towards Asia. What we're really seeing is it's still relatively nascent. I mean, and when you look at our portfolio, we've been in business for 3 years. And then in the 3 years, and I can actually give you the breakdown here, is 44% was from North America, and Europe was about 20%, and then APAC is about 29%. So APAC is still, kind of on the lower end, but that is picking up steam. Dramatic, especially in Singapore. So what we're seeing in Singapore is, I kind of would basically sum it up. There's a couple things. Is it's still quite nascent across the board, but what we're seeing is, number two, is really phenomenal founders starting some really cool companies. Not from countries that you typically would be doing this in, Singapore, Japan, Korea, or China, but we're seeing from really cool founders from like Thailand, Indonesia, Philippines, some a little bit more. Emerging markets are coming up. So that's number two. And I think number three is the consumer demand is still relatively light and lagging because Asian consumers with lower GDP is still a bit price sensitive. But I think that's changing as the COGS go down for these products as they can scale up. Then their product price point will go down, and then you'll start having consumer demand for it as well. So I hope that answered your question.
It does, and I think we will hopefully have time to speak about cell grown meat later. But to your point about the build up of the founders of the companies or the startups that you invest in, what are some, I'm very curious to hear from a VC perspective, what are some of the ESG considerations that you factor in when assessing investments? I mean, do you have like a framework in place or even an impact measurement tool that you facilitate, and how do you apply them in these investment decisions?
We do. Well, let me take a step back. We aspire to, and this sounds like a cop out. It isn't. There's some practical issues where it's a little bit more challenging for us. So to take a step back, we only invest in companies that are really early stage. Meaning, at the end of the day, there's two phenomenal founders. They probably just have created a product in their test kitchen or in a laboratory. They've never gotten investment before ever. So for them, their number one concern is, well, look, we just want to survive and get some initial capital and kind of grow that, right? You can come to us and say, look, we need to apply, I don't know, the MSCI standard on carbon footprint reduction, right? What's your energy efficiency? We can put all those, but again, they're so early stage that it's almost impossible because again, they just need capital just to survive and get over that. We call it the valley of death, right? So that's what we've been focusing on. That being said, that's still no excuse for us. So what we want to do, let me kind of structure this. What we would love to aspire to is then basically have a core set of metrics that we measure every portfolio company on, not initially, because it's impossible. The reality is we just can't do it. They can't do it because they're just focused to survive. But more importantly, once they've gotten to a certain threshold, and we're still kind of working that out, is it a combination of how much capital they raise? Maybe if they raise at least $5 million, they have a team of 20 people, whatever those KPIs are, once that hits in, then okay, then we could put in this framework that we have already kind of thought about, right? Again, carbon footprint reduction, employee health and safety, diversity, inclusion. At that point, they'll have board of directors, is it diverse, et cetera, right? So we have about 7 metrics that we want to implement. We haven't got to that point yet because a lot of our companies, we've only invested for the last 2 years. So most of our companies haven't gotten to that threshold yet. But Christina, we definitely want to get there, right? So to answer just kind of, that's a roundabout question is at this point, I'll be brutally honest, we have not put in an ESG framework to measure companies that we will invest into because they're so nascent and so early stage. But that is not a cop-out because what we want to do is once they've matured and they've hit a certain threshold, which we're still trying to determine, it could be fundraising, employee headcount, top line revenue, whatever it is, then they need to basically qualify for our framework based on, as mentioned, some of the 7 metrics, if they want further capital from us. But at this point, a lot of our companies, actually most of them have not reached that level yet, but we do want to put that in, right?
Yeah, no, that's understandable. And actually, I've been just personally very interested in the very early stage and what is the benchmark there? What is the framework? Because indeed, I mean, our team works with, much later stage, much larger investors and investments. So, but anyway, I want to direct now a question more to Helena and to Eileen. And I mean, given that, seafood and fish is one of the main or the main animal protein source for Asians, what in your opinion are kind of the main areas that financial institutions need to engage their clients in aquaculture on? Especially considering, Eileen mentioned this, and I think it's widely known that aquaculture is one of or the seafood industry is one of the fastest growing sectors. And, are there any alternatives there? And are there any new policies or standards that can be facilitated in alternatives in the aquaculture seafood sector?
Yeah, so I can have a go at answering this. I think some of there was already some information on aquaculture in one of the slides that I presented specifically from our index, and we do have a sort of chapter on aquaculture specifically in our newest index report. But I think the main risk categories that are specific to the sector, for which in Asia specifically, the largest aquaculture producers rank kind of on the higher risk side are, like was shown in the slide, the antibiotics use. So all of the companies that produce seafood rank as high risk on that risk category. And then there's some more specific to aquaculture, like nutrient loading. So nitrogen and phosphorus release into local ecosystems. It can increase eutrophication and cause algal blooms, which harms local biodiversity, and sort of reporting on those factors can help manage those risks. And another finding from the index data was that none of the assessed aquaculture companies based in Asia report on disease management. So sea lice management, for example, is one of the industry's key sort of biosecurity concerns. And these types of diseases are a major cost to the industry, and remedies are currently quite limited in in how effective they are in the long term. And similarly, the aquaculture companies' greenhouse gas emission scores are improving globally year on year, but they're in Asia, they're actually regressing for some companies. So those are kind of the key risk categories in that specific sector that are sort of unique to the sector. And in terms of alternatives, there are, I think in the reporting, we did find some companies in Asia, I think in Thailand specifically, and maybe also Hong Kong based, there were some companies reporting that they're investing in developing crab meat alternatives and shrimp alternatives. But I think it is in the global picture, probably still to a lesser extent than some of the sort of meat alternatives. I don't know if you have anything to add, Helena.
I think that summarizes it pretty well, I think.
No, thank you. Thank you both very much. And what about, this hype around lab-grown meat, specifically in Singapore, lab-grown chicken? So perhaps maybe a question for Christian, or also, the rest of you, feel free to jump in here as well. I mean, Christian, you did mention that Big Idea invests in cell-grown meat as well. How significant are the developments in Singapore at the moment around safety, pre-market testing, as well as policy and regulation, of course? And I mean, what about the rest of Asia? And realistically, because I read somewhere that the data is within the alternative protein market, the cell-grown meat takes up only about 1%. So how realistic is it for this really to be an alternative source in terms of, climate impact and biodiversity loss? How much do we need to invest, and how can we scale this market share of lab-grown meat for it to actually become commercially viable and to kind of tip the needle, to move the needle in that sense?
Yeah, so just as a preface, I'm on the board of Shock Meat, which is founded by two amazing scientists, Dr. Sandy, Dr. Kai as well, right? And they've done phenomenally well in the year and a half, or about 2 years of investing. They're the most valuable cell-based company in Southeast Asia, if not, well, not Asia, because Future Meat raised something as well. So I think what I'd say is I have a love and hate relationship with cell-based. Maybe that's a little bit strong, right? I have a like and not like of cell-based. In this sense, I like because at this juncture, from an investor, well, from the scientific aspect of it, it's amazing, right? So, if you think this, I won't give a timeline, but you think about this in the far future. I mean, it could be where we all have 3D printers in our house and we are basically generating different slices of meat, whatever you want to taste, right? And through the cells, maybe you can even create different that's not word to say, but different composition meat that we haven't even thought existed, right? I just think that's super cool and a super way of thinking about, kind of how scientific and how sci-fi that is. So in that way, that's great. Another way, the reason why I really like the cell-based is, frankly, the valuations have ran so far ahead that from an investor perspective, it really helps your fund portfolio, right? And this can just be completely transparent, right? I mean, I think it's like at this point, the industry is really driven not necessarily off typical metrics because, well, frankly, no one's really selling it, right? So you can't go off of trailing revenue. You can't go off of gross margin, net margin, because they don't have any of that. So what are you basing the valuation off? Are you basing valuation on some kind of, I'd say, some kind of soft metrics, how many cell lines have they been developed? Have they some great technology in terms of bioreactors, yada, 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 right? And it's great for investors because, if you go in early, you're able to get that mark to market at a really high multiple. So in fact, we've been fortunate where two of our cell-based companies have already exited already, right? One company called Peace and Meat out of Belgium, that sold to a public company called MeatTech, right? And after a year, we were on the first investor, and a year later it was exited already. And then we had another company in Singapore called Gaia Foods. That one exited after 6 months. So we've been able to really ride that investor euphoria as it comes to cell-based. So I think that's what we really like about it, or what I really like about it. On a personal perspective, that's also something I don't like about it is, I come from kind of a pure financial background where you do comps based on, again, margins, net margins, trailing revenue, what your COGS are, yada, yada, yada. And if there isn't there, it seems like there's a lot of unwarranted here, and this may be detrimental towards the industry because look, eventually there will be a coming, there'll be a coming home report, right? And if there's not actual metrics and actual numbers and an actual business, a lot of this will crater up. And you have a lot of amazing scientists, amazing people doing work, right? So that's the part that I actually don't like now. So my answer is I'm quite bullish in this sector, but I think you have to have a really long-term lens on it because there are some aspects of it which are not going to get solved in the short term, right? Costs are still exuberantly high. FBS, we still are using, there isn't food grade FBS, so fetal bovine serum, which is horrible to use, but you still need to use that. We need to find a plant-based equivalent of it or some kind of equivalent. So there's a lot of factors that need to come and play into this. And I think my gut is my thesis, and me personally is in the short term, we're going to have a lot of euphoria. Example, Future Meat just raised the largest, they raised $350 million a round, right? One of the largest rounds for, I think in the next, now into the next 3 years, there's just going to be a lot of euphoria, and probably similar to other business that go through a lot of euphoria, you kind of go through, again, kind of what we call valley of death. There will be a burst where people are going to be like, hey, why are they getting these valuations? And the industry can kind of go down a little bit. But I think long term, I think a lot of these are not something that's can't be solved. And I think in the long term, it will be a viable proportion of the protein market globally. Now, Christina, to your question, what percentage of it? I don't know. It's more, I can give you, like this and come up with a number, right? And it will change every month, every year and stuff like that. My gut says it will not be it will be a negligible proportion for these probably 5 years. After 5 years, I think it could, depending if you can get the cost down, and I have full faith that a lot of great entrepreneurs are working that, ones that we've invested in, ones that we haven't invested in, I think it will rapidly accelerate pretty dramatically just because of the scale and how you can kind of produce it in these big massive bioreactors and so forth. So I don't know. In the short term, it's going to be pretty negligible, right? And I think it's going to be built based on kind of aspirational valuation. But after 5 years, I think that's something where we could see it be a good chunk of it. I don't think it will be the full chunk of it, but I think it'll be a good portion of it.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. Thank you for I think that was a very in-depth answer, and there are quite a bit of considerations that we're following as well in the space. And in terms of, animal cruelty and the environmental perspective, but there's a lot that still needs to be done, a lot of details, and I guess a lot on the regulatory side as well. But I mean, I guess I do want to also ask, because a lot of the discussion is around kind of the upstream and, deforestation, specifically, going back to plant-based protein. A lot of the discussion is around the upstream issues, let's say. So I want to ask you, Devin, I mean, around these standards that you're updating currently, I wanted to look into the downstream issues more. There was a recent study that I think I read by Nature Food that, had estimated that emissions from specifically the retail sector between the 1990s and just recently, I think it was 2015, emissions specifically in Europe and the US have risen 3 to 4 times. Now, I mean, what are some of the issues in downstream process, such as transportation, fuel production, and consumption by the sector, industrial processes, packaging, etc. And how can we address these?
Yeah, thanks, Christina. That's a great question. And I think it points exactly to what the SASB standards try to do. So we do have a food retail and distributors standard that, again, highlights those topics that are likely to impact value creation over the short, medium, and long term. And in that standard, we have things like air emissions from refrigeration, which measures global scope 1 emissions and also percentage of refrigerants consumed with zero ozone depleting potential. We have a topic on food waste management and how are companies managing the food waste from their food retail. Same with energy management. And then, even on the safety side or on the consumer side, we have a product health and nutrition metric. And so, I think a great place to start for investors, if they're really interested in knowing what sort of those issues are likely to be important for food retailers and distributors is to go look at the SASB standards for the food retailers and distributors. It may not include everything that investors think is material, but it's what is likely to be material, and that's true for a grocery store, you know, not just in the US, but in the EU and Asia as well. And so I think that there's still a lot of opportunity, and it's really around getting investors to talk to companies to get them to disclose, and then understanding what their year-over-year performance is. I think oftentimes companies are a little scared to disclose actually in their first year because it's not perfect, and so, but really it's about progress of get some numbers out there, communicate how you're doing, and then over time you'll see as your retail business expands, are those energy management or fleet fuel management numbers going down? And that's really how investors can, I think, use the standards to determine how companies are performing. But it really is a holistic approach. It's not just one topic.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. And I do think it's important because this doesn't only relate to, of course, animal protein, but it's, you know, the wide range of substitutes that are on those shopping market shelves and make their ways to restaurants. So, I mean, if we are neglecting the downstream, you know, at the expense of the upstream, that's also an issue. So thanks for that.
One other point too is I think retailers have an ability to put downward pressure or upward pressure on their suppliers to force them to change too, right? So I think there is this growing attention on food retailers of what is their role, both in terms of consumer awareness on like health and nutrition, and for suppliers to become more sustainable, whether in the products that they're producing or reducing their emissions. To your point, sorry.
Yeah, exactly. And to that point, because I see that we're ahead of time. So before jumping into the audience questions, maybe Devin, just to kind of, you know, end with a little bit of a general question to your point. So what are the opportunities, you know, that first of all, you know, sustainability disclosures, but also these enhanced standards that you're working on? What are the opportunities that they present to financial institutions? And then why should investors in particular require more transparency from investing organizations across the value chain?
Yeah, I think to answer your first question, sort of how we're thinking about alternative products in food retailers and distributors, and this is something that we're actively vetting with investors and companies, is, you know, diversification of protein type important to know, and do investors care about private label versus non-private label sales, which I think is a new discussion. Often because food retailers have a little bit more say in what ingredients go into their private label than a national branded products. But I think get more into how companies are performing and what their sales targets are on alternative products, to say, you know, what are those risks and opportunities? Is that, you know, is it good that they're doing more soy-based plants? Is it better that they're doing locally sourced? Like, what are those, again, what are those trade-offs and what does that look like? And in terms of why investors, I think, should care more about disclosure is, as you get more and more companies to disclose in a similar space, you can really understand, okay, what is the inherent sort of industry challenge versus how are different companies performing? But until you get companies to disclose in a comparable way the same type of information, it's really hard to make that assessment and valuation. It's a little bit easier for those investors that are more impact focused. So what are, you know, if they have one issue they care about, it's a little easier for them to dig in. But if you're talking about mainstream investors who are starting these broad ESG funds, you really need to be able to compare apples to apples, and without disclosure, that becomes very difficult.
No, thank you. Thank you for that. And just very quickly, jumping back to Helena and to Eileen, what are, in your opinion, the opportunities in the alternative protein innovation space when it comes to biodiversity gains in particular? I mean, we've seen this, and I'm happy that we're seeing biodiversity loss and nature positive outcomes as, you know, really on top of the agenda. And hopefully we'll see more and more of it this year with developments around the TNFD. But in your opinion, what are the possibilities for nature positive investments into alternative proteins?
Yeah, I'm happy to answer this one. I think that's a really important area for a lot of investors getting more interested in biodiversity risk now this year. I mean, we've had a lot of attention already on climate risk, but now attention seems to be shifting on what the biodiversity risk is there, with TNFD obviously being an important one. And for this sector, it's incredibly important because around 70% actually of agricultural land is used for livestock and animal feed together. So there's been a lot of evidence and a lot of studies out saying that there could be a potential to free up land through the diversification into sustainable protein that we've already discussed. And this could be a way to sort of not only reduce deforestation, but also then reverse deforestation and plant more trees, etc., that would actually contribute to drawing down emissions and also kind of restore nature in that sense through this food transition. So in fact, there was just a study out the other week, which you might have seen, which actually projected that basically the area of the whole European Union might be able to be freed up in terms of land through sort of increased consumption of plant-rich products. So that was quite interesting. So people have been talking about, how sustainable food can be considered as a nature-based solution, really in that sense, because it's one of the most, if not the most important sector for biodiversity and nature, actually, and for species and some of the areas that, in terms of ecosystem risk as well. That's incredibly important, because I think it was around more than 80% actually of the extinction is caused by agricultural expansion as well. So, I think if this can be integrated more into portfolios, into what the food companies are doing, that really has a huge potential. So we're seeing a lot of interest also now from policymakers, obviously with the Biodiversity Summit this year. I don't know whether others want to add anything more to.
No, and just I think to add all to conclude very quickly, I have a question. Maybe Christian might know a lot about this, but feel free, all of you, to kind of participate in the protein world, in the protein market. Where do we need to be innovating? And then Helena, you touched upon this, I think, in the first question a little bit. So perhaps we could expand here. I mean, if you had to compare the food and agri landscape to the energy sector in particular, I mean, what would be the coal or the fossil fuel equivalent in terms of stranded assets or even liabilities in the future?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I think some have sort of drawn quite a lot of parallels with the energy sector, the way that the alternatives now are growing, and that could be a huge opportunity actually for many different sort of investors as well as companies, etc., to get into the growth side of things. I think that there's an interesting, in terms of stranded assets, it's quite complicated, because you might see many different parts of the food system becoming stranded assets, and that's definitely something to consider, I think. Well, we need more research on that, because there hasn't been as much research on the kind of stranded asset risk within the food and agriculture sector. But we are doing some research on that as well this year, as I mentioned, with the climate risk tool being updated. So I think that could be a very useful one. And I just want to draw maybe a quick parallel in the policy side as well, is for the renewable energy sector. And in the energy sector transition, we saw a lot of innovative policies coming in that actually boosted the growth of renewable energy, such as feed-in tariffs. And I'm not sure if we know what the policies are going to be, which will boost the growth in sustainable food products yet, but I think there is a lot of policy innovation happening as well. So things like the R&D investments that are being in Singapore, could see if there's new kind of policies come in, that could also really boost the growth of the alternative sector within the food industry.
Christian, perhaps do you want to add to that as well? Where should we be innovating?
No, I think I can really add quickly is I think where we need to see some innovation is a little bit more downstream from it, which is on the co-manufacturing side. So one of the challenges a lot of our companies have is they may have an amazing idea, they get capital in, but what they can't get is actually get the products produced, right? Because they don't have enough capital to actually have their own manufacturing facilities to actually produce it. Or conversely, they can't go to a typical co-manufacturing of other, food staples, because their minimum orders are too small, or the co-manufacturer doesn't do any plant-based, don't have the right equipment, right? So they're kind of in this this limbo of, hey, great idea, we have some capital, but we can't produce it anywhere. So what we need some innovation is within that sector is how do we get a way that a lot of these really smart, sharp entrepreneurs, whether they're in Asia or global, wherever they are, have access to ability to produce minimum order quantities that is palatable for them so that they can actually see if the product can actually scale. Because if they can't even produce their products, no matter how much innovation they are and how cool it is and can have all different kind of metrics, if they can't produce any of that, then it's all for a moot issue, right? So we haven't seen a lot of innovation, and I think that's been a really large bottleneck. First, for us, we've seen it firsthand, right? Because we only invest in the early stage, but I would imagine it's probably for a global sector, right? So is there a way where there could be some innovation within producing smaller quantities of plant alternative protein that makes it more palatable for a lot of startups so that we can get a lot more products out into the store shelves and therefore see if they can actually scale and if it's a viable product or not.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'm just conscious of time, so I will jump to the audience questions straight away. And I see we have quite a few. The most, I guess, upvoted is by Felicia Liu. Felicia, do you want to mute yourself and perhaps ask the question? Or we can also read it out for you. Okay, there we go. Might need, Nicole, I might need your help to unmute Felicia. Okay, no, I think, if sometimes people aren't really in a location where they can speak. So I'll just read it out for you, Felicia, if you're okay with that. Okay, so it pertains to basically the presentation. She has two questions. First one is, what is the landscape of Asian investor interest in sustainable protein? Are there aspects of sustainable transitions, as Devin has rightly pointed out, it is a holistic system of change that Asian investors are more or less receptive to? Perhaps we can tackle that question first and then go into the second one. Does anyone want to answer that question specifically?
I can try to jump in and give our perspective. I think honestly, what the hardest part of understanding what is decision useful for Asian investors from our perspective is how we're framing alternative products or sustainable proteins, because what that means in one culture is very different than what that means in another. So how do you holistically measure performance on this in a comparative manner across countries and regions and markets? And so really what would be helpful from my perspective is getting Asian investors to be willing to contribute and have calls with us to figure out what those metrics are so that we're serving that market the best that we can.
Thanks, Evan. And have you seen differences, or are there differences in the types of engagement strategies that are more effective to others, specifically with Asian headquartered companies?
Not that I know of. We've had a few conversations with Asian investors who have said that they are engaging with companies. I think that it kind of depends on the type of company that they're engaging with, just like any other market. I haven't been privy to understanding if there's a big difference between Asian markets and non-Asian markets. So can't really speak to that aspect of the question.
Okay, great, thank you. And I see we have two from Charles Liebergreen. Charles, do you want to unmute yourself? Don't be shy.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, so my first question was really a comment around the and versus the or traditional products. I guess I'm of the vein that it's and rather than or. And in that light, what do the panel think about the role of life cycle analyses in the eyes of investors?
Thanks very much, Charles. Does anyone want to tackle that? Helen, I see you nodding. I don't want to put the spotlight on you, but I don't know if you have a direct answer for that.
Yeah, no, I mean, just add that I think life cycle analysis is a very important tool, because that sort of is one of the key tools that people are using to kind of disclose. But sometimes the data can be hard to find as well for the life cycle analysis. I think that's, I can see Devon nodding, but I think that is one of the challenges for using that tool as well. But we have seen quite interesting life cycle analysis comparing, say, the alternative product with the conventional products that, you know, often those used for sort of marketing purposes and so on. But I think, as you put in your question as well, energy consumption is a big challenge for some of the alternative products. So that's probably one that would have to be integrated in future, and renewable energy sort of being available as well if there's a high energy consumption. But yeah, just nothing more specific than that. But I think that it is very important.
Thanks very much. I don't know if anyone else from the panel has anything to add to the question.
I would just say I think LCAs can play a really important part, but oftentimes when we're talking to more mainstream investors, they don't have time to dig into the nitty gritty of the LCAs and what went into it, and is it an estimate or how accurate is it? So I think from our perspective, it's more about, are companies doing the LCAs and scenario analysis, and then are they communicating that they're doing that to investors to show they're trying to make progress and they're doing this analysis internally, less so on are investors actually seeing the result of LCAs. And it may also depend on the type of investor.
Yeah, thanks, Devon. I see that most of the other questions were answered in the Q&A, but please, if you do have any in the meantime, please do drop them. I have a question in regard to policy, perhaps, because we always have this, chicken or egg, carrot or stick conversation. But I guess, Helena, I know that you're probably, quite aware of the different policies or regulatory developments that happen around the world, but specifically in Asia, have you seen, any best practices or anything that will really help this transition? Or, not just in terms of alternative protein, but just in general to more sustainable production, to the more sustainable production of food and, having sustainable food processes.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's already been mentioned in some sense, but I think Singapore has been sort of positioning off as a leader when it comes to the food sector innovation. So the technologies such as sustainable protein, but also sort of vertical farming was gathering a lot of interest. And I think some of the drivers behind that, from what I've heard, was the 30 by 30 goal. So the fact that Singapore wants to produce more food domestically. So I think food security can be a driver, and Singapore's goal to produce 30% of its food domestically by 2030 has been a big driver. And then some of what I've heard about why that's a very kind of interesting approach on the regulatory side is the fact, obviously, the approval of cell-based food, that was a global first for Singapore, but also having quite a consultative approach to the regulatory approval. So that's quite innovative, and also sort of allowing companies to sort of ask questions and to iterate during that application was quite important, especially for an emerging sector. Whereas in some other countries, by comparison, a company would submit food for approval. They might not hear back for a year or 18 months, and then finally they'll hear they got a rejection or ask for more information. Whereas I think a more consultative approach can be helpful, where, follow-up questions are allowed. Then that actually enables companies to, go through the regulatory process in a smoother way, but without kind of compromising on food safety and those areas. So I think food safety is also very important, actually, obviously, because nobody wants to see, sort of alarms raised for food safety risks. So that's why, obviously, it has to be, managed in a very careful approach with regulatory approval, but also food safety. So I think that's a really good example coming out of the region as well. But obviously there are other examples. And another really interesting point sort of made mentioned by Aline's presentation is also innovation in regulatory approaches on financial disclosure, because obviously as more countries, say, require disclosure of information, say on climate risk or on nature biodiversity risk, that will actually enable there to be a better information for investors about what they're actually investing in and what the risks are to their investment really. So I think that, yeah, the examples of improvements on financial disclosure are very important, and Singapore's also been doing a lot of innovation in that area too.
Yeah, thank you very much for that. Yeah, there are constantly, developments here, and I think Singapore is indeed a very good example in many cases, especially with the developments coming on from the Monetary Authority of Singapore and the ambition to kind of shape Singapore into a green finance hub. I don't know if any of the rest of you have any kind of insights into policy or regulations and how this is helpful to you. All right, with that, I think that we can, unfortunately have to wrap up this conversation.